The Beginning, a series of crimes that shook the city Los Angeles, the city of angels, known for its bustling streets, shimmering skyline, and endless pursuit of dreams. But beneath the glitz and glamour of Hollywood, a shadow began to grow, a shadow so dark and menacing that it would bring the entire city to its knees. The streets that once symbolized endless opportunities became the hunting grounds of a pair of criminals unlike anything the city had ever seen. A wave of terror began to spread as their violent spree intensified, targeting unsuspecting victims in places that were considered the very definition of safe. It started subtly, almost as if it were a whisper lost in the daily noise of the city. A mugging here, a robbery there, seemingly random acts of urban crime. But soon after, the patterns emerged, unmistakably calculated, chillingly consistent, and viciously bold. These weren't your everyday street hustlers. These were predators operating with precise efficiency. Their targets were not chosen based on wealth but vulnerability. Young professionals, elderly pedestrians, and even parents walking with their children, they didn't discriminate. They brought fear not just to dark alleys but to broad daylight in open spaces and in full view of an overwhelmed and horrified public. Cameras became witnesses to their chaos, catching brief glimpses of two figures, one tall and powerfully built, the other smaller, wiry, yet equally ruthless. Eyewitness testimonies were fragmented. "There was no warning," one shaken survivor stammered. "The tall one came from behind like a ghost, the shorter one, those eyes were ice cold." Streets once buzzing with life grew eerily quiet as night fell. People changed their routines, avoiding bridges, overpasses, parking lots, and even public parks. The boldness of their attacks shocked even seasoned law enforcement officers. Their victims described how they operated almost like a synchronized team, swift, efficient, and merciless. They weren't just looking to rob, they left their victims scarred physically and emotionally, and the rumors, the whispers, they only added to the mounting fear. "It's like they enjoy it," another victim recounted, her voice trembling. "The violence isn't a means to an end, it's the point." What made their crimes even more unnerving was their choice of timing, mid-morning or early afternoon in heavily trafficked areas. Places like shopping mall parking lots, pedestrian bridges, and even the outskirts of schools, spots that many believed were the safest corners of the city. Witnesses frequently reported hearing screams but arriving too late, only to find people bleeding, their belongings stolen, and the culprits vanished into thin air. In some cases, people simply froze, watching helplessly. It wasn't cowardice, it was the shock, the speed, the absolute audacity of it all. Los Angeles Police Department quickly found themselves in uncharted waters. This wasn't a random string of incidents. Statistical anomalies began popping up on crime maps, with the chaos radiating outward from central Los Angeles like a spreading fire, its tendrils reaching the outer neighborhoods. Detectives recognized that these crimes followed a pattern, but the problem was, every time they tried setting traps or placing patrols, the criminals shifted tactics. Were they watching the police? Were they blending in with the chaos of urban life, hiding in plain sight? Then there were the headlines. The local media pounced on the story, dubbing them the Bridge Reapers. The name invoked both mystery and terror, a pair of faceless figures whose only message seemed to be a cryptic, brutal form of vengeance against society itself. Every crime brought more scrutiny and more fear. Families began locking their doors a little tighter, avoiding public spaces altogether. Parents clutched their children closer, eyeing every passerby with an edge of suspicion. Whatever their motive, whatever their endgame, the city knew one thing for certain. These weren't mere criminals. This was something far more sinister. Nightclubs emptied out early. Side streets became deserted as the sun lowered in the sky. The people of Los Angeles, a city so vibrant and alive, were now gripped by an unfamiliar silence, a heartbeat of anxiety that pulsated in every corner of the metropolis. And the authorities? They knew time was running out. Every new attack was another scar on the city's image, another crack in the facade of safety that everyone relied upon. But behind closed doors, the LAPD were grappling with the hard truth. They were chasing shadows. The criminals wore nothing identifiable, no colors, no gang affiliations. DNA evidence was minimal, largely obliterated by the rush and chaos of urban life. Witnesses were unreliable, their memories often blurred by the sheer speed and surprise of the attacks. "We've seen violence, this is Los Angeles, we've seen it all," a senior detective grumbled during one press interview. "But this feels different, it's personal, they want to be remembered. They want to carve fear into this city's spine." These were no longer just stories or rumors being passed in coffee shops and late-night news segments. The reign of terror brought by these two individuals was real, visceral, and terrifying. Behind every closed door, behind every distracted glance on a crowded street, behind every anxious gaze into an empty parking garage, the city of Los Angeles braced itself. Because when predators like these lurk among millions, the wolves aren't the ones hiding from the light. It's the herd who clutches one another tighter, wondering not if they'll strike again, but when. Timing, the shock of broad daylight. It was the brazenness of their crimes that struck Los Angeles at its core. These weren't atrocities committed under the cover of darkness, hidden in shadows or desolate alleyways where danger often lurks unnoticed. No, these attacks happened when the sun was high in the sky, in plain sight for the world to see. What was once thought of as the safest time of day, mid-morning and early afternoon, became the most perilous hours, as two criminals turned cement walkways and suburban parking lots into battlegrounds for terror. They attacked me at 11:30 a.m., in a shopping mall parking lot, one distraught victim recounted. I just finished grabbing lunch with some coworkers and didn't think twice about walking to my car. It wasn't late, there were still people around, but that's when they struck. They didn't care if anyone saw. The cold precision of their timing frightened even the most composed citizens. Busy streets and bustling bridges, typically alive with commuters, parents walking their children, and workers enjoying a quick coffee break, became their chosen hunting grounds. Witnesses reported fleeting glimpses of the duo striking with the agility of predators on the prowl. For most, there was no time to react. As chilling as the suddenness of their attacks was, what truly unnerved the community was the methodology, abrupt, ferocious, and always in broad daylight. "You'd think that you're safe during the daytime," said another victim, a middle-aged man who had been attacked just outside an office building during his lunch break. "There wasn't a single thought in my mind about danger when I left the building to grab some fresh air. But they didn't give me a chance. One hit from behind and I was down. By the time I realized what was happening, my wallet and phone were gone, and so were they." The locations were meticulously selected: pedestrian overpasses, suburban shopping malls, and isolated parking garages, all populated enough to suggest safety but wide open enough for quick getaways. They straddled the line between visibility and anonymity, capitalizing on the false sense of security that comes with familiar public spaces. These were the types of places where most people lowered their guard. Who could imagine that in a city brimming with traffic and movement a pair of criminals would be so bold as to attack in full view of passers-by and security cameras? And yet they did. Surveillance footage, though often grainy and incomplete, captured their modus operandi. The taller of the two often moved in first, a figure of intimidating size and swift movements. He didn't speak, he didn't hesitate, his approach was clinical, cutting off escape routes before victims even realized they were cornered. The shorter of the two, sharp-eyed and wiry, delivered the threats. His voice carried a venom that could freeze anyone in their tracks. "Don't scream, don't move. If you do, we'll leave you wishing you'd done as we asked." It wasn't an idle threat. Though their primary objective appeared to be robbery, the level of violence escalated with nearly every attack. Law enforcement officials pieced together a timeline that painted a disturbing picture. The crimes weren't committed because they were forced into desperation. They were executed with planning, adaptability, and, most unsettling, a kind of cruel enjoyment. It was as if they thrived on the shock and terror they inflicted. What made their timing so perfect, in a horrifying sense, was its unpredictability. There wasn't a specific routine, no exact method to predict when or where they'd strike next. They'd hit an overpass on Lincoln Avenue at 10 a.m. one day, then resurface a week later outside a daycare center during early pickup hours, their very presence dissolving any semblance of safety during these windows. Even the LAPD found themselves caught off guard. Officers stationed near the city's most bustling areas found themselves in a constant game of cat and mouse. "All the analytics in the world can't make sense of this," said one frustrated detective. "They're working off an unorthodox timeline that most criminals wouldn't dare to consider. Daylight crimes in crowded areas, even the boldest criminals know better, but not these two." In some instances, their timing wasn't just opportunistic, it felt deliberate, a way to announce that nowhere and no one was truly safe. On one occasion, they targeted a mother loading groceries into her car outside a big-box store. The surveillance footage showed her screaming as the taller man grabbed her purse, shoving her away while the shorter accomplice trashed her car in search of valuables. The child, still strapped into the car seat, wailed in confusion. "They robbed me in front of my baby boy," she sobbed when reporters asked her about the incident. "That's not just criminal, that's evil." Reports of such attacks sent waves of panic through the city. People stopped taking shortcuts over pedestrian bridges. Shoppers avoided large parking lots unless they could park far enough from the edges. Families planned their errands around the sun's position in the sky, mistakenly believing early mornings or late afternoons might offer reprieve. But the unpredictability of the duo rendered such precautions useless. "It was psychological warfare," another victim described. "They knew that by choosing the times and places we felt the safest, they weren't just taking wallets, they were stealing our peace of mind." Soon, the fear became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Sidewalks once busy during lunch hours grew strangely deserted. Pedestrian bridges became ghostly passages, traversed only by the most hurried feet. The rhythmic hum of daily city life dulled into an uneasy melody of paranoia. The city had been hijacked, not by a virus, not by economic downturn, but by the chilling audacity of two individuals who relished in the chaos they created. The echoes of their crimes reached beyond the victims. Parents started walking their children to and from school armed with pepper spray. Security guards at office buildings and mall entrances became more vigilant, though even they admitted, quietly, that they felt unprepared to intervene should the Bridge Reapers, as the media began calling them, next decide to strike. If there was one common thread across the crimes, it was the precision of their timing, not in the sense of synchronized clocks, but in their ability to weaponize everyday routines against the people of Los Angeles. By attacking during moments of peak comfort, they turned the act of living itself into a precarious gamble. That gamble, for many, was no longer worth the risk. Methodology: sophisticated and brutal. It wasn't just the time or place of the attacks that terrified Los Angeles, it was the sheer brutality and calculated efficiency with which they were carried out. These weren't impulsive crimes of desperation. This was methodical, unrelenting violence that seemed to be carried out with surgical precision. The infamous duo, quickly dubbed the Bridge Reapers by the media, left a trail of destruction that was equal parts chaos and strategy. Every attack followed a chillingly predictable formula. And yet, what made them so terrifying was how unpredictable they felt. The pair didn't operate like traditional thieves or robbers who merely wanted to grab and run. They operated like hunters. They didn't just take what they wanted, they made a point of dominating their victims in a way that left not just physical wounds, but deeply etched psychological scars. "They came at me from behind," recalled a victim, her voice shaking in a televised interview. "I didn't even have time to scream. One punch and I was already on the ground. By the time I could even process what was happening, they were gone, with my phone, my purse, and my sense of safety." The taller of the two, described as a stocky man in his late 20s or early 30s with an imposing build, often struck first. Witnesses described him as silent and calculating, moving with an unsettling calmness even during moments of aggression. He carried a metal baton that seemed to appear out of thin air, swinging it with ruthless precision to incapacitate his targets. The shorter one, wiry and quick, acted as the director of their twisted symphony. He barked commands at victims in a voice that dripped with venom and carried a steel pipe that he wasn't afraid to use. Often he ensured the victims were too stunned or terrified to resist. "Stay down," he would snarl while rifling through pockets or bags. "Make a sound and I'll make you regret it." They were swift, too swift for most victims to resist or process what was even happening. From the moment the taller assailant delivered the first blow to the point where both disappeared into the shadows, only seconds passed. Their efficiency was chilling. "They didn't act like they needed anything," said another survivor who sustained a fractured wrist after being slammed into the wall of a pedestrian bridge. "It wasn't the money or my phone that they cared about, it was the fear. They wanted me helpless." Their tactics evolved with each attack, making them even harder to predict or catch. At first, the duo targeted solitary pedestrians in wide-open spaces, parking lots illuminated by harsh daylight or quiet pedestrian crossings where victims felt they were safe in plain sight. But as the police began to focus resources on those areas, the criminals adapted. They began shifting to narrower spaces, places like covered walkways, overpasses, and dimly lit corners with limited escape routes. What was perhaps most terrifying was their preference for total anonymity. Despite carrying out dozens of attacks, neither left breadcrumbs for law enforcement to follow. Early police attempts to trace their movements through security cameras proved almost fruitless. The tall one always kept his face obscured, pulling a hood snugly over his head. The shorter one? He wore a baseball cap pulled so low that you'd never even catch a glimpse of his eyes. They neither spoke loudly nor lingered in areas where they could risk observation. "Every video we have of them tells the same story," one investigating officer explained in a press conference. "They come in, they overpower, they take what they want, and they vanish. It isn't sloppy, it isn't reckless. It's calculated, plain and simple." Their choice of weaponry only added to the atmosphere of terror. Unlike many street criminals who relied on knives or guns, tools that typically require little proximity, these two relied on close combat objects like steel pipes and crowbars. The decision was both practical and sinister. Weapons like knives or firearms could escalate the charges they faced if caught, but blunt instruments allowed them to inflict maximum damage while minimizing legal risk. In the hands of the Bridge Reapers, these crude instruments became extensions of their cruelty. "They didn't leave me with a stab wound," said one man, now recovering from a skull fracture after being attacked under a highway pedestrian bridge. "They left me with nightmares. Every time I hear metal clinking, I feel it all over again." But their methodology wasn't only shockingly brutal, it was adaptable. After every incident, the duo seemed to refine their approach. They studied police responses and adjusted their attacks accordingly. When officers increased patrols near pedestrian overpasses, the pair shifted their focus to outdoor retail centers. When security was ramped up near open spaces, they moved to secluded entryways and parking garages instead. It was like they had access to the city's pulse, constantly staying one step ahead of both the authorities and their terrified prey. Worst of all was their escalation. Violence wasn't just an unfortunate byproduct of their crimes, it was the point. At first, their attacks left minor injuries, bruises, scraped elbows and pulled muscles as victims tried to flee. But over time, the severity increased. Victims began showing up in emergency rooms with broken bones, concussions, and in one case, a collapsed lung after a pipe blow to the ribs. "You don't ramp up your actions like that unless you're enjoying it," said a criminal profiler brought in to consult with the LAPD. "For some, the thrill of the chase is enough. But for these two, the escalation is deliberate. It's a power play." The psychological toll of their tactics echoed through the city in ways the police couldn't quantify. Phone alarms blared louder than before. Joggers tucked themselves into avoided residential streets. Children on playgrounds grabbed their parents' hands when they heard footsteps behind them. It was as though these two criminals had pulled an entire metropolis into their nightmarish grip, without ever saying more than a handful of words. Their methods are designed to humiliate as much as to harm, one trauma therapist noted after hearing survivors' accounts. They strip away your control, your confidence, your sense of agency. It's not just about taking a purse, it's about taking away who you are. What drove their seemingly bottomless capacity for calculated violence remained a mystery to authorities. Some suspected it was economically motivated, a way to gain fast cash and lay low, but others couldn't ignore the signs of something darker. The glee the shorter man seemed to take in intimidating victims. The perfectly timed coordination between the two. The precision of their strikes, aimed at knees, ribs, or backs. It begged a terrifying question for the city of Los Angeles. What happens when criminals don't just attack for survival but instead to feed their thirst for control? The first victims speak out. In the immediate aftermath of their attacks, as news began to trickle out across the city, the victims themselves emerged as both the first witnesses and bearers of the city's rising nightmare. Many were too shaken to speak, their recounting peppered with tears, trembling hands, and interrupted words filled with fear and disbelief. Others, driven by outrage or a need to warn the community, found the courage to share the harrowing details of what had happened. Their voices painted a chilling portrait of two shadowy figures whose acts were as calculated as they were brutal. "They came out of nowhere," sobbed Sarah C., a local real estate agent targeted on an otherwise uneventful Thursday. "I was walking to my car after grabbing coffee. It was broad daylight. I felt someone behind me, and I thought it was just another person heading to their car. Next thing I know, I'm on the ground, and there's this weight pressing down on my chest. I heard someone yell, 'Keep quiet!' And then I just froze. I couldn't even scream." Her hands trembled as she described how the taller of the two men rummaged through her purse while the shorter one stood guard, his sharp dark eyes darting around. "It wasn't just about taking my things," she whispered. "They wanted to scare me. They wanted to break me." For many victims, the shock wasn't just the violent nature of the attacks. It was the utter brazenness of them. Los Angeles residents generally thought themselves street smart, aware of their surroundings. But this was different. These attacks didn't happen in dark alleys or dimly lit back streets. They took place in parking lots, on pedestrian bridges, and in bustling areas where safety should have seemed guaranteed. I was walking with my dog Clyde, recounted George M., a retired schoolteacher. We just finished a loop around the block and I decided to take him over the bridge since we'd never gone there before. I saw two men leaning against the rail up ahead. They were smoking and chatting like they were just regular people, so I didn't pay them any mind, but as I passed, I felt a blow to my back and I was on the ground before I even knew what happened. George paused, collecting himself before continuing. The taller one grabbed my wallet. The shorter one? He was the one who unnerved me. He looked like he was calculating everything. He just stared at me like he already knew I couldn't fight back. He said something like, "You're lucky you're old," then motioned for the other guy to move. They walked off like nothing had happened, laughing like it was some kind of game. George's dog, Clyde, barked uncontrollably during the entire ordeal, but no one intervened. By the time passers-by arrived, it was too late. The pair had vanished. Jessica L., a college freshman who was attacked in a parking deck near her university, shared a similarly haunting recollection. "I saw them before they saw me," she said. "Well, at least I thought I did. I was getting out of my car. I noticed these two guys standing by a column a few rows away. I thought it was weird because they weren't walking to a car, just standing there, waiting. I even told myself, be aware of them, lock your doors. But before I could, one of them came around the passenger side, and the other was at my door. It all happened so fast. One grabbed my phone, my wallet, even my laptop backpack. The other raised a metal pipe like he was going to hit me, but instead he slammed it into the hood of my car and just smiled. What chilled me most," Jessica continued, her voice thin and trembling, "was that smile, like he'd done it 100 times before and didn't care." Perhaps most telling of all, however, were the victims' descriptions of the attackers themselves. The duo, one considerably taller and broader, the other wiry and twitchy, seemed to operate as if rehearsed. Victims often spoke of the taller individual acting as the physical enforcer. "He didn't talk," one woman said. "He didn't need to. His presence alone made me freeze." The shorter man was different. He was vocal, sharp-tongued, as if he fed off the terror in their victims' eyes. "I made the mistake of talking to him," admitted David P., a local artist. "I told him I didn't have any cash, that he could just take my phone. I thought if I kept calm this would be over quickly, but he laughed. It wasn't the kind of laugh meant to break the ice. It was cold, empty. He said, 'Oh, I'll take it, but I don't like easy.' That's when the tall guy pushed me against the wall and I felt the pipe swing against my ribs." David spent 2 nights in the hospital with a fractured ribcage, a sprained wrist, and a concussion. Each story layered itself into a growing profile of fear. Los Angeles residents began noticing strange behavioral changes in themselves. Women pushed panic buttons on their car keys as soon as they reached parking lots. Men avoided bridges altogether, opting to walk 15 extra minutes around neighborhoods instead. Seniors, often the most vulnerable, organized walking groups carrying pepper spray and tasers just to feel some semblance of control. Yet it only took one attack to spotlight the cruel reality. It didn't matter who you were, how careful you acted, or how prepared you thought you might be. If they chose you, you were their prey. "I still see them in my dreams," said one middle-aged father after recounting how the men attacked him outside his son's elementary school. "I wasn't trying to be a hero, I just didn't want my son to see me get hurt. I told them, take whatever you want, just leave us alone. But the little one," he slapped me, then muttered, "Pathetic," loud enough for my boy to hear. I'll never forget the look on my kid's face, watching me helpless like that. His voice broke mid-sentence, but the message was clear. These criminals didn't just take material things, they took something far worse: dignity, peace, and a sense of control. For law enforcement, these testimonies proved invaluable but also deeply frustrating. Officer Angela Rivers, an LAPD detective assigned to the investigation, summed it up. Everything about their behavior screamed power play. For them, it wasn't just about stealing whatever cash or phones these people had, it was about control, dominance. They wanted their victims to feel small, to relive the moment over and over in their minds. Even as law enforcement ramped up efforts to stop them, the accounts from victims continued to haunt the city. Each new attack only sharpened the fear, the helplessness, and the growing sense that something truly sinister was stalking the streets of Los Angeles. What's worse, it was hiding in plain sight. The rise of fear. Los Angeles had always been a city that thrived on movement. From early risers jogging in Griffith Park, to the busy lunchtime crowds flooding outdoor cafes, to nightlife venues buzzing with energy, it was a place where time rarely stood still. But as news of the attacks spread, the rhythm of the city began to change. Subtly at first, a few cautious glances over shoulders, or people avoiding certain pedestrian routes. But eventually, the fear became palpable, a steady undercurrent that seemed to grip the city tighter with each passing day. The brutal nature of the attacks, coupled with their unpredictability, created an intense psychological pressure on residents. These weren't ordinary crimes. They felt personal, invasive, and terrifyingly brazen. Stories from the victims began to spread in coffee shops, workplaces, and even whispered conversations in parks. Parents warned their children to avoid bridges entirely. People who once parked confidently in open lots now scouted for spaces closer to security cameras or entrances, some choosing to avoid such areas altogether. Stacy Nguyen, a healthcare worker who relied on pedestrian bridges to commute between her job and the parking lot, described how her daily life was transformed. "I used to take shortcuts through the overpass every day. It saved me 10 minutes, she said, fidgeting nervously during an interview. "Now, I don't care if I have to walk all the way around. I'll take the long way. I'm not putting myself in a position where I could end up on the news." Others began adjusting their routines in ways that felt almost surreal. Dog walkers and joggers started carrying pepper spray or walking in crowds. Social media posts popped up with detailed warnings about unsafe zones and suspected sightings of the criminals, the citizens of Los Angeles self-organizing in the vacuum of answers from authorities. However, the truth was, no matter how cautious you were, the randomness of the attacks made everyone a potential target. "The fear gets in your head," said James Alford, a documentary filmmaker who lived in the normally tranquil neighborhood of Silver Lake. "I used to enjoy walking home from the cafe holding a latte, just letting the sun hit my face. Now though, I only look down at my feet or over my shoulder. I'm alert all the time, but even then, would I even see them coming if they chose me? Probably not." And then there was the media. The local press initially covered the attacks as isolated incidents, the way one might report any standard robbery. But as more reports came in and patterns emerged, the narrative shifted. Frightened headlines reading, "Daylight Danger, Criminals Strike Again," or "The Bridge Reapers Terrorize LA," appeared on front pages. Morning news shows aired interviews with victims who nervously clasped their hands, recounting their encounters with trembling voices. Each broadcast seemed to deepen the citywide paranoia, further cementing the image of the duo as unstoppable predators. Even schools weren't immune to the growing fear. Outside a local elementary school in downtown Los Angeles, parents began to arrive earlier than usual, forming clusters at pickup time. They traded safety tips in hushed tones while scanning the area. "No one moves alone," one mother said, holding her toddler tightly as her older son climbed into the back seat of her SUV. "We pick up each other's kids. We text when we're nearby. We're keeping watch for each other, but it doesn't feel like enough." Police patrolled these same areas with increased frequency, but their presence had a double-edged effect. While on the one hand making people feel slightly safer, on the other, the very sight of police cars crawling through neighborhoods was a stark reminder that nowhere was truly safe. The LAPD issued public service announcements with preventative tips and reassurances, but behind the scenes, officers were well aware of just how little progress they were making in catching the criminals. "This city's always had its share of crime," said Officer Diane Chavez, a 12-year LAPD veteran, in an anonymous interview. "But this feels different. We don't know who they are, where exactly they'll strike next, or why they've decided to terrorize these random spots. People are terrified, and we can't give them the answers they need. It's frustrating for everyone." Panic bred paranoia. Neighbors began mistrusting neighbors. The man standing on the corner with the hood pulled up suddenly seemed suspicious. Forgotten bikes in alleys or discarded pipes near bridges brought calls to 911 from residents fearing evidence. A city once alive with communal energy seemed to dull, as squeaky shopping cart wheels in parking lots or unannounced footsteps behind you on a bridge sent chills down spines. Perhaps most startling was how this fear began to seep into every facet of daily life. Outdoor events saw significant drops in attendance. A local charity walk held on the west side of town had its smallest turnout in years, with organizers admitting certain routes had to be rethought to avoid pedestrian bridges. Gym memberships surged as more people chose indoor options for exercise rather than risk being out on the lonely streets. After-dark happy hours turned into early dinners, with patrons rushing home well before sundown. "I don't know who they are, but they've changed us," said Evan Patel, a bartender in Hollywood. "People used to hang out with their friends, laugh, have a drink, and just enjoy the city. Now, everyone's on edge. Even here at the bar, my regulars keep glancing at the door like they're waiting for someone to storm in." The fear wasn't only for physical safety, it was a fear of losing what Los Angeles had always embodied for so many people: freedom. The freedom to walk wherever you pleased, to linger outdoors on a warm afternoon, to stand idly on a bridge overlooking the glitter of highways below. That freedom was now weighed down by the constant, suffocating question, "Am I next?" And then there were the whispers, "Why hasn't anyone stopped them?" The longer the crimes went unsolved, the more the murmurs of frustration turned to anger. Online forums became littered with theories, some claiming the duo were masterminds from out of town, others speculating on ties to organized crime. But even with theories circulating, there was little information that could put anyone's mind at ease. The police were no closer to identifying the Bridge Reapers than the public was, and that knowledge only made the city's fear grow sharper and more oppressive. As Los Angeles moved into the fall months, the warm summer sun that usually signaled endless possibilities now seemed to beat down on a city too afraid to enjoy it. Every parking garage, every overpass, every shadowed walkway seemed like a potential trap. Residents began whispering about moving away, off to calmer suburbs, or even entirely out of the state. It wasn't just the crimes themselves, it was what they said about the city. For all its vibrancy, charm, and allure, Los Angeles was now a place where fear didn't just live in the dark, it thrived in broad daylight. The trail of missteps from failed captures. Time and time again, law enforcement came close enough to hear their footsteps retreating into the distance, close enough to see fleeting figures on grainy surveillance footage, close enough to feel the sting of missed opportunities settle deep in their collective consciousness. But close wasn't enough. With every failed attempt to stop the Bridge Reapers, the criminals seemed to grow bolder, the city's fear more profound, and the police's confidence more fragile. The Los Angeles Police Department, LAPD, known for handling some of the nation's toughest cases, suddenly found itself in unfamiliar territory, a psychological chess game against enemies who seemed to anticipate their every move. Early on, the department attempted to downplay the severity of the situation, reluctant to escalate public panic. The first few attacks were treated as isolated incidents, typical of Los Angeles' sprawling urban crime scenes. But when patterns emerged and the frequency of the crimes increased, the LAPD launched a series of operations to put an end to the chaos. And yet, every move fell short. The first significant effort came shortly after the media began covering the incidents. Detectives worked overtime to analyze crime scenes, drawing radiating maps of where the attacks occurred. "We need to narrow them down, box them in," one officer recalled during a debriefing. The plan seemed sound: increase patrols near bridges, quiet parking lots, and pedestrian overpasses, the hot spots where the duo seemed to strike. Officers on foot and in squad cars waited in the shadows, hopeful their presence would result in a swift takedown the next time the attackers surfaced. But the next time they hit, it wasn't at a pedestrian bridge or a parking lot. It was in a family-friendly neighborhood where a woman jogging with headphones in broad daylight was ambushed on her route. By the time police arrived, the suspects were long gone, their victims sobbing on the curb while neighbors buzzed with fear and whispers of, "How could this happen here?" "They're watching us," one officer admitted after the failed operation. "How else would they just know where to go next? It's like they can read our movements, like they're 2 steps ahead of every setup we try to run." This sentiment only deepened with each subsequent attempt to corner the criminals. Surveillance cameras became the primary focus of the second wave of police efforts. Footage was combed through, analyzed frame by frame, any fragment of a clue scrutinized. Yet every video told the same frustrating story: 2 figures with faces obscured by hoods and caps, striking fast, efficiently, and then disappearing into the labyrinth of the city. No identifiable features, no distinctive clothing, no out-of-place vehicles waiting nearby. They moved like ghosts through the busiest city in America, and to the frustration of law enforcement, they vanished just as effortlessly. Desperation began to creep into the investigation. The department ramped up manpower, pulling officers from other units to patrol the streets harder and longer. Detectives set decoys, placing plainclothes officers in areas the duo might consider as targets. At one point, rumors swirled about undercover officers jogging on high-risk pedestrian paths, their ears wired with communication devices while backup teams waited nearby. Yet the decoys didn't work, and all the extra boots on the ground didn't matter. The duo didn't just avoid the traps, they seemed to shift tactics every single time the LAPD thought it had them figured out. "We waited for them," noted Officer Miguel Herrera, one of many involved in a failed stakeout near a popular overpass. "Hours, maybe more. We thought for sure they'd come. It was the perfect spot. Limited exits, easy visibility once they started moving." But they didn't show. Instead, they hit 2 blocks over in some strip mall parking lot. By the time we radioed over and got there, they were gone. Again. It became a game of cat and mouse, but the predators weren't the police. Instead, it was the 2 criminals who seemed to hold all the cards. They blended into the city's chaotic heartbeats seamlessly, prowling just beneath the surface of recognition. Officers often reported seeing suspicious individuals matching vague descriptions of the suspects, but every interaction led to nothing. Just another hooded man walking his dog or another wiry figure carrying groceries back from the market. "They didn't stand out," Herrera added. "That's what made them so maddening. They could be anyone. Any guy at the bus stop, in the corner store, or sitting on a park bench. They knew how to vanish into the city, right under our noses." The frustration wasn't confined to the streets. Inside LAPD headquarters, morale began to waver. The press conferences announcing progress had stopped. Internally, there was mounting tension between officers and detectives as resources were poured into dead-end solutions. Investigators combed databases for patterns in similar crimes, searching for record matches that might lead them to possible suspects. The pressure caused rifts. Were these common criminals with a flair for theatrical violence, or calculating predators with a chilling amount of intelligence? Months into the spree, the department escalated efforts further, bringing in criminal profilers and behavioral analysis experts. The profiles painted a disturbing picture. These weren't opportunistic crimes, they were deliberate. The profilers hypothesized one of the assailants, likely the shorter one, had a background in organized crime or a history of violent arrests. The more stoic, silent one was thought to have military training, evidenced by his precise movements and the speed of his attacks. But even knowing this didn't bring them any closer to identifying the culprits. Another police effort, this time focused on digital tracking, proved equally fruitless. Hoping the stolen phones used by victims might yield some useful data, police subpoenaed records, hoping the suspects had slipped and activated one of the devices. But instead of quick wins, the traces revealed cold reality. Not one of the stolen phones had been turned on, not one of the credit cards had been used. The duo wasn't just evasive, they were disciplined, as if they understood how to avoid every conventional means of capture. "They're not like anything we've dealt with before," a detective working the case admitted anonymously. "They don't leave a trail. It's like someone trained them, maybe not for this exactly, but for something close. They feel too organized." The mounting failures began taking their toll on the city. The LAPD faced criticism from both the media and the public as parents, business owners, and everyday citizens demanded answers. "How many more people have to get hurt before they do something?" asked one local resident during a news interview. But doing something was easier said than done. Despite nationwide attention on the case and even federal agencies offering assistance, the duo remained uncatchable. With every failed operation, the duo seemed to grow emboldened. Whispers started circulating that they wanted the police to fail, that the missteps were part of some larger psychological warfare they were inflicting on the city. The question wasn't just whether the LAPD could catch them. It was whether Los Angeles could survive the constant state of fear, a city paralyzed not by earthquakes or fires but by shadows moving through the streets, always uncaptured, always just one step ahead. The 2 villains in the shadows. They were called many names in the media: the Bridge Reapers, the Duo in the Shadows, LA's Nightmares, each title capturing the fear and fascination Los Angeles felt toward these 2 faceless figures terrorizing the city. Among law enforcement officials, however, one name was whispered more than any other: ghosts. Because that's precisely what they were: untraceable, intangible entities moving through the sprawling metropolis, leaving destruction in their wake, but no trail to follow. What made them even more unnerving wasn't just their anonymity, but their dynamic, a sinister partnership that felt uniquely complementary. Each seemed to bring a necessary ingredient to their twisted brand of terror, one the muscle and calm executioner, the other the brains and venomous instigator. Together, they operated as though they had rehearsed every scenario dozens of times, as if their brutal crimes were the outcome of calculated planning rather than baseless chance. The taller of the two was the enigma, the presence. Described by victims as stoic, silent, and almost robotic, his towering frame seemed built for intimidation. He didn't waste words, but he didn't need to. His energy spoke louder than any threat could. Witnesses claimed that when he approached, calm, measured, composed, it created a suffocating tension, the kind that froze people in fear. Once he attacked, there was no hesitation. His blows landed with purpose, aiming for critical spots, knees, ribs, backs, anywhere it would cause the most damage in the shortest amount of time. He didn't talk to me, not once, one victim recalled in an interview, her voice trembling. Just grabbed me by the collar and threw me against the wall. It was like being hit with a freight train, and his eyes, I'll never forget his eyes. Cold, distant, like I didn't even register as a person to him. Former military, trained in martial arts. Theories swirled among law enforcement about the tall man's origin, but nothing solid ever came to light. What they did know was that he was methodical. From his ability to evade surveillance cameras to his precise movements, his presence in the partnership felt almost professional, like a hired hand performing a job he'd been doing for years. But it was the shorter one who unnerved people the most. Where the taller man's strength felt emotionless, the wiry, sharp-eyed partner radiated menace. He was the one who spoke, taunted, and relished in the chaos they created. It was his voice victims remembered, acidic, cutting, and disturbingly calm. "He looked at me like he wanted me to squirm," said David P., a victim who was assaulted and robbed in a pedestrian underpass. "The tall guy had already hit me, I was on the ground, but the shorter one? He bent down, got real close to my face, and said, 'You should be thankful. It could have been worse.'" Then he smiled, like he enjoyed watching me freak out. The shorter man seemed born for manipulation. Victims often recounted him as the ringleader, using fear as a weapon more devastating than the steel pipe he carried. While the tall man delivered the physical blows, the smaller one worked to ensure his victims were paralyzed by terror, either frozen in place or too scared to make a sound. His movements were quick and deliberate, darting in and out of blind spots like a shadow that refused to stay still. "He was the one who looked like he was hunting," another victim observed. "Not just for money or wallets, but for something else. It's like he wanted our fear. He thrived off it." Law enforcement and criminal psychologists began piecing together a profile of the two men, though every guess was clouded by speculation. Many believed the shorter man came from a rough, perhaps criminal background. His mannerisms, his speech pattern, a gritting, clipped drawl reminiscent of the southeastern United States, hinted at someone who had grown up around violence, someone who knew how to wield it as both a physical and psychological weapon. "His words weren't just threats," explained a profiler brought in to assist with the case. "They were designed to cut deep, to make you feel helpless, like resistance was futile. That's the mark of someone who's either done this before or spent years mastering how to break people without even laying a hand on them." Together, the two men wielded their contrasting talents, one coldly efficient, the other a sadistic provocateur, and created an atmosphere of terror, the likes of which Los Angeles hadn't seen in years. They didn't just attack to steal, they controlled. They forced their victims into submission, robbing them of their peace of mind as much as their wallets and bags. It was personal, visceral, and haunting. Every victim walked away feeling like they'd been chosen for reasons they couldn't comprehend. But where had they come from? This question gnawed at the LAPD, whose resources were stretched to their limit trying to decode the duo's backstory. Some officers believed they were drifters moving from city to city. Others argued their timing and execution suggested locals who knew the city intimately. Whoever they were, it was clear these two weren't amateurs. They'd either done this before or spent considerable time planning how to do it. Even their appearance, so devoid of identifiable features, seemed intentional. No vivid tattoos, no scars. Their clothing choices, hoodies, caps, jeans, were generic enough to render them unmemorable in a crowd. Yet victims would often comment on how impossible it was to forget the feeling they left behind. "They didn't look special," one witness recalled. "No flashy clothes, no loud voices, but you felt them. When they walked toward you, everything in your gut told you to run. Or freeze. I froze." Law enforcement's theories only deepened when an anonymous informant, believed to have ties to gang activity in East LA, claimed to recognize the shorter man's voice. "Sounds like someone I served time with," the informant reportedly said. This revelation raised alarming questions. Had the pair met in prison? Was this spree part of a long-standing grudge against society? The tall man's background remained an even darker mystery. Unlike his partner, he spoke rarely, if at all, operating with a detachment more common to trained professionals. His movements suggested strength and precision, but was it brute force or disciplined practice? Investigators debated endlessly over whether his mannerisms suggested time in the military or a history in something like private security. Whatever the truth, their complementary styles worked together seamlessly, a partnership that felt as deliberate as their crimes. They balance each other, the profiler concluded. One acts as the hammer, the other as the scalpel. Together they're not just thieves, they're predators. Los Angeles isn't a city easily shaken, but the presence of these two villains, moving unseen but unmistakably felt, left cracks in its residents' collective confidence. Fonts of creativity, ambition, and diversity, the people of Los Angeles saw themselves as untouchable, able to weather earthquakes, wildfires, and mass migrations. But these two figures proved there were still shadows even the brightest city couldn't chase away. For all the LAPD's manpower and all the speculation from reporters, no one could answer the question everyone was asking. Who were these men? And even worse, what would it take to finally stop them? The motive behind the crimes. Identifying the motive behind a string of crimes as terrifying and brazen as those committed by the Bridge Reapers was anything but straightforward. The assaults and robberies seemed random. The victims, locations, and times appeared unconnected by any discernible pattern. To most, it looked like these were simply opportunistic criminals, attacking for cash, phones, or valuables. But to detectives and criminal profilers tasked with unraveling the mystery, it became increasingly clear that this reign of terror wasn't driven solely by financial need. This was about more than money. When you look at the level of violence, the unpredictability of their timing, and how personal these attacks feel, the conclusion becomes clear, said Dr. Evelyn Morales, a forensic psychologist consulted on the case. This isn't just a series of robberies. These men are lashing out at the city itself, at society, at humanity in general. The money, that's secondary. The power, the fear they create, that's the real goal. The evidence backed her up. Even when large amounts of cash or high-value items were taken, the stolen goods were rarely trafficked or sold, at least not in a way that could be traced. The duo consistently avoided using stolen credit cards, activating stolen phones, or pawning expensive jewelry. Clearly, they weren't in it to make a buck and vanish into the night. That left only one reasonable conclusion. Their crimes were a message, a brutal form of revenge wielded against a city that had somehow wronged them. Many speculated that these were men on the edge, shaped by lives of poverty, hardship, or injustice. In fact, early profiling painted a chilling backstory. Men who had grown up in violence, nurtured by environments rife with neglect and survival-driven decisions. But then, as witness accounts grew, so did another theory. It wasn't just desperation or bad circumstances, it was rage. They don't just steal, they dominate, Dr. Morales explained. That's the difference between a thief and a predator. Money might be what kicks off a robbery, but their level of violence, cruelty, and control suggests something deeply personal. To them, this is kind of a reckoning. They're not just taking, psychologically they're striking back at a world they think has failed them. Early in the investigation, rumors swirled linking the shorter man, the wiry, sharp-tongued leader of the duo, to a stint in prison. He had been described by some sources as someone with a past rooted in petty crimes that eventually escalated to violent felonies. Former acquaintances anonymously reported that he left the correctional system angrier than when he walked in, harboring an intense grudge against authority and anyone who had it easier than he did. It's not uncommon for criminals in this situation to leave prison with a chip on their shoulder, said retired law enforcement officer Mark Delgado, now a consultant in organized crime investigations. What makes this case unique is the way that anger manifests. He doesn't want to just get even. He wants to watch people break, to humiliate them, to spread that sense of helplessness he's felt his whole life. That kind of rage doesn't disappear, it finds a way to explode. For years, California's justice system has been burdened with cracks that leave former offenders like him in a revolving door of instability. It's plausible, detectives suggested, that his motive for orchestrating these attacks stems from his inability, or unwillingness, to reintegrate into society. But what fueled his partner? The stoic, towering enforcer? The tall man proved to be an even greater enigma. Unlike his wiry counterpart, the larger man rarely spoke, leaving his motivations shrouded in mystery. But with his precision and control, some wondered whether his background included more formal training, perhaps in the military or a field requiring discipline and combat skills. If he was once tied to law enforcement or the armed forces, this could add another layer of complexity to their motives. Two men bonded by bitterness toward systems that had once shaped or failed them. The Profiler team began exploring the psychological dynamic between the two men as a critical window into their motivations. There's a shared anger here, but it's carried out in very different ways, Dr. Morales explained. The shorter man is the fire, volatile, expressive, commanding. He's driven by his need to taunt, dominate, and leave an emotional scar. The taller man, he's the ice, precise, controlled, and devastatingly effective. Whatever draws them together, their motives feed off of each other in a way that amplifies the destruction they leave behind. However, interviews with victims pointed to something else. The crimes were often too calculated, too personal. In one case, a victim reported the shorter man saying, "You people deserve this," as he sneered down at her, rifling through her purse. In another, the taller man hesitated for a brief moment when a victim pleaded, "Please, I've got a family." The hesitation lasted long enough for his partner to snap, "That won't save you." Detectives wondered if the phrase, "you people," was a hint at their motivation. Were the crimes about class warfare, a deliberate revenge against the well-off or the privileged? Yet their victims ranged widely, from college students to elderly retirees to working-class grocery store clerks, offering no clear socio-economic targets. "There's a deeper hatred here," observed Officer Angela Rivers, a lead detective on the case, speaking at a press conference. "They're targeting random people because to them, everyone represents the same thing. The world they believe owes them something. It's blind resentment." As the duo's spree intensified, some speculated that what began as vengeance had evolved into addiction, a dependency on the high they got from each attack. Criminal psychologists compare this escalating behavior to that of serial offenders who crave the rush of control, the thrill of manipulating or hurting others. For the shorter man in particular, many theorized that the verbal taunts and cruel insults were just as essential to his fix as the robberies themselves. Eventually the money didn't matter, Dr. Morales elaborated. They started escalating the violence, the cruelty, because that's what was truly feeding them. These acts weren't about survival, they were about power. They wanted to own their victims, even for a few fleeting moments. That's why these crimes felt so different, so personal. But while much of the psychological analysis fit together, one piece of the puzzle remained elusive. What sparked the spree in the first place? Why did these two men, among millions of other disillusioned and frustrated individuals, lash out at Los Angeles so precisely and viciously? Some speculated the attacks were sparked by a personal vendetta. Perhaps they had lost something or someone, homes, jobs, family, and the crime spree was their answer. Others believed that their elaborate methods and deliberate evasion of capture pointed to something far more organized, even planned. Could they have been testing the waters for something bigger? Using the spree as a launch pad for even more destructive goals? Detectives feared such a possibility but could not confirm it. In the end, the motive was as much about what couldn't be seen as what could. The crimes weren't just about money or frustration, they were about control, about vengeance, about leaving a scar on the city that couldn't be erased, even after they disappeared. Los Angeles residents speculated endlessly about the why, but for the victims and the investigators scrambling to catch them, the bigger concern became not what drove them to attack, but what might come next. Could a city filled with millions ever feel safe again knowing that somewhere in the shadows, two men were acting out their hatred one victim at a time? Joining forces to unmask the villains. By the time law enforcement fully realized the scale of the threat posed by the Bridge Reapers, the city of Los Angeles had already been swallowed by a suffocating cloud of fear. The duo's relentless attacks, designed for both chaos and control, had transformed urban spaces into hunting grounds and made routine tasks feel like high-stakes gambles. It wasn't just about catching two criminals anymore. For the LAPD, the stakes couldn't have been higher. They weren't just fighting for justice, they were battling to restore sanity to an anxious metropolis. But chasing these two shadowy figures wasn't something the LAPD could accomplish alone. In a rare effort of collaboration, the department launched an unprecedented operation, pulling together every resource at their disposal. They brought in detectives from nearby precincts, specialists from the FBI, and even behavioral analysts from outside the state. It became clear that only a unified effort, built on coordination, data, and a willingness to adapt, could stand any chance against two criminals who seemed to thrive in the chaos of an unorganized response. "Los Angeles is big, but we knew we couldn't let them keep using the city to their advantage," said Captain Rodrigo Torres, head of one of the LAPD's special task forces assigned to the case. "They were moving like ghosts through the urban jungle, exploiting our blind spots, our routines. It was like playing chess against opponents who knew which moves we'd make before we did." The task force wasted no time. Multiple teams were formed to focus on different aspects of the investigation. One team analyzed the methods, locations, and patterns of past attacks, hoping to find hidden connections between the crimes. Another combed through every scrap of surveillance footage available, meticulously piecing together the duo's movements, no matter how small or fleeting the details. A third team zeroed in on understanding the psychology of the criminals, studying each attack for clues to their thought process, their motives, and, ultimately, their identities. Meanwhile, boots were hitting the ground harder than ever before. Patrol efforts were doubled in high-risk areas, particularly near bridges, parking structures, and isolated pathways. Police presence became so visible that some residents felt a flicker of hope for the first time in months. But it wasn't enough to be reactive. The task force knew they had to be proactive, forcing the duo into a corner where mistakes could be made. And yet, for every step law enforcement took forward, the duo seemed to slither backward just out of reach. Their unpredictability became their greatest weapon, appearing in one part of town one week and resurfacing miles away the next. Officers on stakeouts, many putting in sleepless hours watching potential target zones, often found themselves frustrated when those efforts turned up nothing. "It felt like they knew we were waiting for them," said Officer Danielle Hayes, who worked numerous late-night shifts shadowing bridges near downtown LA. "The minute we'd double down on one area, they'd strike somewhere completely unexpected." But there was still hope in unity. The LAPD's tech unit began using predictive analytics, drawing on data from previous attacks to identify potential hot zones. Maps were created, layered with statistical models that showed where crimes were likely to occur based on urban density, escape routes, and timing of past incidents. This data was cross-checked with behavioral insights from FBI profilers, who suggested that the duo would likely revisit certain locations or exploit areas they believed had gone unchecked. The campaign to track every corner of the sprawling city also folded in partnerships with private entities. Businesses, particularly those in high-traffic zones like parking garages and shopping centers, were encouraged to tighten their surveillance systems and report even the slightest suspicious activities. In a first-of-its-kind program, food delivery drivers, rideshare operators, and even public transit workers were looped into the operation, acting as additional eyes and ears across the city. "We had to think differently," said Detective Marcus Lee, a lead investigator on the case. "These guys weren't playing by the usual criminal playbook, so we had to get creative. We tapped into the city itself, the people, the systems, the patterns. It became a community effort." Much of the public responded eagerly, seeing the battle to catch the Bridge Reapers as a cause that united strangers into neighbors. Residents organized neighborhood patrols, sharing information in WhatsApp groups and Reddit threads. Parents volunteered to buddy up during school drop-off or pickup times, ensuring children weren't left in vulnerable situations. The phrase, "see something, say something," wasn't just a slogan anymore, it became a mantra for survival. Still, not every effort bore immediate results. Even as tips poured in, many led to dead ends. Grainy footage from cameras often showed only shadows disappearing into the night, while eyewitness testimonies were often vague when describing two men who deliberately dressed not to stand out. The criminals' discipline, never activating stolen electronics, never using the same escape routes twice, kept them just out of the crosshairs. However, one break came unexpectedly. A surveillance video from a gas station near Echo Park captured a fleeting but crucial detail. One of the men briefly adjusted his jacket, exposing a unique tattoo on his wrist. Though the image was blurry, it was clear enough for analysts to identify it as a gang symbol, one tied to a defunct gang from East LA. This one led opened a new avenue for detectives, who began cross-referencing known associates of the dissolved gang with behavioral patterns that matched the shorter man's description. Another break came through sheer determination on the part of LAPD's surveillance team. A detective monitoring recent attacks noticed a subtle pattern. Each time, the duo seemed to navigate toward areas with limited cell coverage or poorly lit exits, indicating that they had a nuanced understanding of the cityscape. Officers deduced that this understanding likely came from someone who was deeply familiar with the city's infrastructure, further strengthening the working theory that the taller man might have a professional background, possibly in construction or even law enforcement itself. Behind the scenes, technology played a pivotal role. Heat mapping tools were deployed to track where unusual activity clustered, while drones equipped with motion-sensitive cameras scanned areas lacking adequate coverage. Officers in helicopters quietly patrolled the city's outskirts, keeping eyes on potential escape routes. Every detail, no matter how minute, was fed into a growing database in the hopes that one piece of overlooked information would crack the case wide open. The collaboration reached its peak during one pivotal week, which saw the LAPD conducting what they referred to as a city lock. Key pedestrian zones, high-traffic pathways, and even downtown parks were all placed under near-constant surveillance, not just with patrols but by strategically positioning officers undercover as civilians. Detectives dressed as joggers, dog walkers, and shoppers all spread across targeted zones, operating on the assumption that the duo couldn't resist striking again. Although these operations were exhausting, each one brought law enforcement a step closer. "We knew we couldn't outlast them," said Captain Torres, reflecting on the near breaking point. "But we could outsmart them. We could study their moves until there were no moves left." Finally, after months of agonizing surveillance, data collection, and community collaboration, the patience and efforts paid off. A police officer stationed near a pedestrian bridge in East Hollywood radioed in, reporting two figures matching the suspect's descriptions, shadowing a woman walking alone. Within moments, units sprang into motion, converging on the scene with precision and purpose. What followed was a chase through the labyrinthine alleys and underground parking levels of Los Angeles, a pursuit so intense it could have been a scene from an action thriller. The criminals zigzagged through service staircases and fire exits, ducking into shadows and leveraging their knowledge of the city's layout, but for the first time, they were cornered, and the very anonymity they had relied on to blend into the city was their undoing. Thanks to teamwork, sophisticated planning, and a city that refused to back down, the reign of the Bridge Reapers was brought to an end. The climactic chase. It was the kind of morning Los Angeles was known for: clear skies, warm light reflecting off glass skyscrapers, and the bustling hum of city life. To most residents, this August day started like any other, with commutes to work, quick coffee stops, and casual conversations about errands and plans. But for the Los Angeles Police Department, this morning felt charged. There had been a buzz in the air for weeks, a sense that their exhaustive efforts to unmask the Bridge Reapers were finally circling in on a breakthrough. "We don't know when or where, but it's coming," Captain Rodrigo Torres told his officers during the roll call briefing just an hour earlier. "Stay sharp and trust your instincts. I don't care how small a movement seems. If it feels off, you act." The reinforced surveillance protocols and heightened patrols were spread across many of the city's vulnerable zones, particularly pedestrian bridges, parking lots, and dense urban corridors. Detectives and uniformed officers alike had been stretched thin after weeks of high alert status. Anxiety was high, although unspoken. The department and the city were both desperate for resolution. At 8:45 a.m., just as most people were settling into their routines, a routine patrol officer stationed near a pedestrian bridge in East Hollywood noticed something unusual. A pair of men were lingering in the shadowed areas of the overpass, standing at an angle just out of the sun's reach. They weren't moving, weren't conversing. The taller one leaned slightly forward, watching as an unsuspecting woman crossed the bridge ahead, holding a cup of iced coffee with her bag slung over her shoulder. The officer's hand instinctively went to the radio clipped to his shoulder. Possible suspects matching Bridge Reaper descriptions, shadowing a single civilian, requesting backup. His voice carried an undertone of urgency, but he maintained his composure. He didn't approach immediately. Instead, he trailed the suspects from a distance, keeping them in his peripheral vision. Within minutes, additional units were mobilizing toward the location. Helicopters were placed on standby, their crews prepared to surveil from above. This time there would be no overreaction, no blown cover. This time the LAPD had studied every failure and knew exactly how to capitalize on the moment. The duo, still unaware they'd been spotted, continued to move closer to their intended victim. The shorter man, as described repeatedly by victims in the past, carried himself with a kind of electrified confidence, a predator about to strike. His taller partner, as usual, remained stone-faced and silent, as though his very presence was the weapon they intended to unleash. But then, a change, a small flicker of attention, perhaps a noise too faint for most to notice. a shift in the atmosphere behind them, a subtle sign they weren't alone. The shorter one tilted his head ever so slightly, scanning his surroundings. For an instant his sharp gaze caught sight of the patrol car idling just further down the bridge's pedestrian service road. His posture stiffened. "It's them!" he hissed through gritted teeth, tugging on his larger partner's sleeve. Like animals sensing danger, both seemed to freeze for a brief second, each calculating their next move. Then they bolted. The radio waves lit up. "They've noticed us! Suspects fleeing west from the overpass! On foot!" What followed was a chase that felt like the explosive climax of a Hollywood action thriller. Multiple units closed in on the area as the suspects darted into the dense labyrinth of alleyways and side streets that crisscrossed East Hollywood. The shorter man, wiry and swift, led the way. His taller accomplice followed close behind, his powerful strides making up for his lack of agility as they maneuvered through dumpsters, fences, and narrow service corridors. "They're heading toward the parking structures," a dispatcher's voice echoed over the radio as officers adjusted their strategy. The duo played their cards with expert precision, taking sharp turns and using their knowledge of the city's nooks and crannies to evade pursuit. The shorter man vaulted over a chain-link fence dividing two residential blocks with practiced ease, his partner following moments later, though clumsier in his sheer size. Helicopters circled the area above, their searchlights combing the sprawling urban landscape below. Inside the LAPD's command center, the chase was being tracked in real time. Officers monitored surveillance footage from nearby traffic cameras and drones deployed earlier that morning. "They're going toward the underground parking lot off Melrose," an officer announced. On the ground, officers coordinated to seal off potential escape routes. Marked and unmarked vehicles screeched to block entrances and exits while units on foot tightened the net. But this was unfamiliar territory for law enforcement. Not only were the suspects uniquely skilled at disappearing into the city, but their confidence gave them an edge most criminals didn't possess. "They're doubling back!" one officer shouted as the pair emerged from an alley, sprinting toward an adjacent office complex. The shorter man, always looking for an opening, barked sharp commands to his partner. "This way! Cover the side, damn it!" The tall man stopped briefly, grabbing a loose piece of pipe left on the ground, a makeshift weapon in case they encountered any officers too eager to close in. His steps quickened as they entered the dimly lit interior of the parking garage, the fluorescent lights flickering ominously overhead. The smaller man scanned the area, his sharp eyes darting to every shadow, every reflection. "We're not going down here," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. His confidence, however, was betrayed by the slight crack in his voice. The duo was cornered, and they knew it. The moment officers stormed the entrance, there was no time for hesitation. Commands echoed through the cavernous space. "Put your hands up! Now! Stop where you are!" The shorter man swore under his breath, his hand twitching toward his pocket as though reaching for a weapon. His larger partner hesitated for a brief, weighty second. Perhaps he knew the confrontation was inevitable. Perhaps he realized the escape they had managed so effortlessly before wasn't going to happen this time. The LAPD wasn't taking chances. Within seconds, multiple tasers were deployed, the electrical crackle cutting through the air as both suspects went down, their bodies writhing briefly before falling limp. Officers moved in swiftly, pinning them to the ground as they secured the scene. Cheers erupted through police radios, followed by exhausted sighs of relief. "Suspects are in custody. Repeat, suspects are in custody. Code 4. Above the bridge where it all began, the morning sun now seemed to shine a little brighter. The reign of terror that had haunted the streets of Los Angeles was over, not with a grand standoff or an explosive finale, but with an intricately orchestrated pursuit and a rare moment of precision execution from a united law enforcement team. For the officers who had spent sleepless nights on the hunt, the sense of victory was accompanied by a sobering realization. The arrest of the Bridge Reapers wasn't the end of the story. It was simply the conclusion to a harrowing chapter in Los Angeles history, a chapter that left scars on a city and its people, serving as both a warning and a reminder of the resilience required to overcome even the darkest shadows. The explosive confession. The interrogation room was cold, lit by a single fluorescent light that flickered occasionally, casting eerie shadows across the plain metallic interior. Two chairs faced a worn steel table, the etched graffiti from years of hardened criminals scrawled faintly into its surface. Sitting across from each other were two detectives, both seasoned from decades of experience, and the shorter of the two criminals, the man who had masterminded the terror spree that had gripped Los Angeles. His wiry frame seemed smaller now, deflated under the weight of weeks spent on the run, and the realization that the game was finally over. Still, his eyes retained the same sharp, snake-like glint detectives had come to expect from a man who thrived on fear. He leaned back casually, his wrists handcuffed to the table, as if he hadn't just been dragged here after one of the most intense manhunts in the city's history. "You're gonna talk," said Detective James Holland, his voice calm but weighted with authority. Years in the LAPD had taught him that patience would crack even the toughest criminals. "Might not be now, might not even be tonight, but sooner or later you'll tell us everything we want to know. You've got two choices here. Make it easier for yourself, or don't." The smaller man smirked, his lips curling just enough to ignite frustration in the room. "What makes you think I got anything to say?" His voice carried a venomous quality, somehow both low-pitched and cutting, the kind that burrowed into a person's skin. Detective Angela Rivers, Holland's partner, pulled a chair close to the table, her movements deliberate. She was known for her no-nonsense approach, the kind of detective who could read people as easily as flipping pages in a book. "Your partner already gave us something to work with," she lied casually, knowing full well the tall man had remained silent since their arrest. "You want to guess who's going to cut the first deal? Him, or you?" The criminal's smirk faded instantly, and his body stiffened. Angela could see the wheels spinning in his head, weighing options, calculating the level of trust, or lack thereof, between him and his accomplice. "That's cute," he said after a pause, though his tone betrayed the flicker of unease creeping in. "But let me save you some time, he's got nothing to say, and neither do I." The detectives exchanged glances. They'd been here before, hours stretched into days when dealing with men like this, criminals who thought their silence would be their shield. But Angela sat forward, her elbows resting on the steel table, and changed strategies. "You know," she started, her voice softer now, almost conversational, "what really blows my mind about this whole thing? A smart guy like you, wasting his time on people who didn't stand a chance. You're clearly not some run-of-the-mill thug. You had a reason for what you did. The way you planned everything, the coordination, the timing, the escape routes, it wasn't random. But here's the thing, people are going to fill in the blanks if you don't say anything. Reporters, psychologists, even us sitting here. They'll create a story for you, the wrong one, and by the time they're done, no one's going to care why you actually did it. You'll just be another monster for people to point at, nothing more." The man's jaw tightened, his fingers twitching against the handcuffs. Angela saw it for what it was, the first crack in his armor. "You've got a story," Holland chimed in, his voice low and steady. "Maybe it's worth telling, maybe not. But sitting here in silence, that's your call. The real fun will be watching the media get it all wrong while you rot in some high-security cell." A silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, until the shorter man finally leaned forward, the cuffed chain on his wrists clinking faintly as his elbows hit the table. "You want to hear why I did it?" he asked, his voice dripping with mock amusement. "You really want to know?" Rivers and Holland waited, letting him fill the quiet on his own terms. It was a psychological rush, the control men like this craved, but also the exact crack they'd exploit to make him talk. "You think this city gives a damn about people like me?" he started, his voice suddenly louder, sharper. His body leaned forward now, his wiry frame taut with renewed energy. "Huh? You think anyone in those skyscrapers sitting back in their cushy high-rise condos gives even half a rat's ass about what happens to the people in places like Boyle Heights, South Central, or those jacked-up motels just off the freeway? Nah, they don't even see us. Not until we make sure they do." It came out like a venomous rant, his clipped words charged with the years of disdain and anger he'd bottled up. Angela remained unfazed, her face unreadable as she let him vent. "You want the truth? Yeah, I went to prison. Big deal. You know what I learned in there? That it's all rigged. Doesn't matter how many parole hearings you pass, how many halfway houses you get dumped in. It's over the second you walk out those gates. No jobs, no second chances. Just cops waiting for you to screw up again so they can toss you right back like nothing changed. So yeah, I fought back. I didn't do it because I wanted wallets or phones or all that other crap. I didn't do it for money. Hell, we barely even used half of what we stole. I wanted people to remember me, to remember us, to feel what it's like to have something ripped away, even for a second. I wanted them to live with the same fear I've had creeping up my spine since I was 6 years old. Powerless, helpless. I wanted them to know what that feels like." He exhaled heavily, his rant finally abating. His body sagged slightly in the chair, a far cry from the smug figure who had been brought in just hours earlier. But there was something else there, too, pride. He hadn't just confessed to the crime, He'd justified it, at least in his own mind. "And the tall guy? What did you promise him?" Holland prodded, keeping his tone light but deliberate. "Heh," the man chuckled darkly, his eyes glinting at the memory. "I told him it'd be fun. And for a while it was. Big guy's not half as dumb as he looks, you know? Just needed someone to wake him up. And me? I was the wake-up call." In that moment, as the smaller man sat back with an almost smug satisfaction, the chilling reality of his confession sank in. He didn't view himself as a criminal. He viewed himself as a force, a reckoning for what society had done to him. And the trail of fear he'd left behind, that was his message, his mark on a city he despised. Holland gestured silently to the camera in the corner of the room, signaling that they had everything they needed. Angela stood, her chair screeching against the tile floor. The man looked up at her, his earlier smirk only slightly fading. "What's next, detective?" he asked mockingly. "You paint me as some psychopath on TV, parade me around as LA's Monster of the Year?" Angela leaned in close, her voice low and ice-cold. "You're not gonna be a monster. Monsters are too big, too scary. You'll be nothing more than a footnote in every victim's story, and that's all you'll ever be." With that she turned and walked out of the room, the sound of her boots echoing down the hallway. Holland followed, the door slamming shut behind them. The conclusion of a nightmare. The trial that followed the arrest of the Bridge Reapers was nothing short of a spectacle, a collision of fear, justice, and public outrage that gripped Los Angeles as tightly as the reign of terror the duo had once unleashed. For months, the city had lived in the shadow of these two men, figures who had turned the streets, parks, and overpasses into hunting grounds. Now, it was the city's turn to speak. The courtroom was packed from wall to wall on the first day of proceedings, reporters scrambling for headlines while victims and their families sat in silent resolve, their faces pale but determined. Rows of burned-out detectives from the LAPD filled the back benches. This wasn't just another trial, it was closure. On the stand, the shorter man radiated the same twisted confidence he had shown in the interrogation room. He entered the courtroom as though he were the star of the show, his wiry frame framed by an ill-fitting orange jumpsuit and cuffs that clanked loudly with his every move. The taller man, in stark contrast, was a shadow of his former self. Silent and withdrawn, he looked like a ghost of the fearsome figure who had once terrified an entire city. During the trial, he refused to speak, neither denying nor confirming the countless charges levied against him. Some said his silence was a sign of remorse. Others believed it was the final act of defiance from someone who had been caught and no longer saw a way out. The prosecution spared no effort in laying out the horror of their crimes. Using witness testimony, crime scene footage, and vivid descriptions of the attacks, they painted a damning picture of two individuals who had operated without mercy or conscience. Audio recordings from victim interviews captured trembling voices recounting the moments that would haunt them forever. A mother described shielding her child with her body while the shorter man sneered and spat insults. A middle-aged executive broke down as she described the paralyzing fear of seeing cold, ruthless eyes staring her down as her wallet was ripped from her hands. 1. The most damning evidence, however, came from the confession recordings taken after their arrest. The words of the shorter man, full of venom and a warped sense of justification, were broadcast to the courtroom the same way they had been burned into the minds of the detectives who had captured him. "These people never cared about us," his disembodied voice echoed through the courtroom speakers. "So why the hell should we care about them? Yeah, I did it. I made them feel it. I made feel it. Isn't that what they wanted? To know what it's like to live scared?" At that moment, the courtroom felt eerily silent, as though every breath had collectively caught in people's throats. Defense attorneys, knowing the odds they faced, argued for mitigating circumstances. They painted the shorter man as a product of the foster system, brutalized by neglect as a child, and hardened by a justice system that churned him out without a chance at rehabilitation. They described the taller man as a damaged veteran, struggling with PTSD and dragged into a spiral of violence by a manipulative partner. These weren't monsters, they argued, but broken men shaped by a system that had failed them. But their pleas fell flat with the victims seated just a few feet away. The room echoed with quiet sobs as people relived their traumas in the shadow of the men who had caused them. It might have been true that life had dealt these two men a bad hand, but to the people of Los Angeles, their choices to inflict suffering on innocents made them irredeemable. When the time came for the verdict, it was delivered swiftly. On all counts, armed robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, Attempted murder. The list stretched endlessly, and each new word of condemnation felt like another brick in the walls of justice built to contain them. During sentencing, the judge addressed the courtroom with a grave expression, the weight of the city's pain carried in her words. Los Angeles is resilient, she began, casting an unwavering gaze at the defendants. But your actions have left scars that will last far longer than your memory. This city will heal, but you will spend your remaining years living with the consequences of the chaos you've created. Nothing will justify what you've done, not in this lifetime or the next. The shorter man smirked, leaning forward in his seat as though ready to fire off one final insult to the courtroom. But the taller man, breaking his weeks-long silence, muttered just 3 words that cut through the tension like a blade. "I'm sorry," he said. For the first time, the room felt a pang of something unexpected. Was it pity? Too late for redemption, but the faintest glimmer of humanity cracked his otherwise stoic demeanor. The courtroom exploded into stunned murmurs as the judge gestured for silence. Whatever he meant in that moment, whether it was an apology, a ploy, or a realization of what he had done, no one would ever truly know. That was the punishment handed down. The Bridge Reapers wouldn't see the light of day again, yet their capture and trial were not the end of the story. The terror they unleashed lingered in the hearts and routines of Angelenos. Some victims continued therapy for years, haunted by flashbacks of parking lot attacks or predatory gazes. Obvious changes spread across Los Angeles as public spaces were transformed. Bridges outfitted with more cameras, parking garages fitted with brighter lights and additional patrols, neighborhoods organizing watch groups. The LAPD, celebrated for finally apprehending the 2 men, took the opportunity to evaluate its own strategies, hoping to avoid another reign of terror on their streets. "We learned from this," Captain Torres said during a press conference. "We'll never let it get this far again." But it wasn't just police or policymakers who had to rebuild, it was the city itself. Over time, people returned to jogging through parks, stopping in overpasses for scenic views, and running errands without reminders of panic in every shadowed corner. It wasn't immediate, progress rarely is, but LA's heartbeat, persistent and unyielding, began to blaze brighter than the darkness cast by the Bridge Reapers. Years later, the story would fade into whispers, interspersed among urban legends, told over drinks at late-night diners or during car rides down familiar streets. "You remember those guys, right? The Bridge Reapers?" someone might ask. And the reply, no matter how detailed or vague, always ended the same way. "Yeah, crazy times. Never thought they'd catch them, but they did." In a city built on dreams and reinvention, even the worst of nightmares eventually fade into the backdrop. And for the people who lived through it, the lesson wasn't just about justice or resilience, it was that no matter how dark the night, the sun would rise again over Los Angeles.